so thank you very much for joining me today. The white paper, the housing white paper has landed. It's been great to see it finally and to have a look through the very many provisions in there. It'd be great to talk to you about some aspects of the white paper today. I'd like to start with you, Ian, and just ask you a very general question really, which is what new opportunities do you see for greater collaboration between local planning authorities and the development industry in terms of the proposals in the white paper?
We've been pushing for a number of years a campaign to try and introduce an institutional investment sector into the UK in terms of investing in residential accommodation, what we call build to rent. And an important part of the white paper, I think Chapter 3 covers build to rent and really codifies a number of the practices that we started to see in terms of local authorities and developers, and sort of puts that on a national footing. So that's something that I think is very positive. There are parts of the white paper that talk about sort of tempt us in terms of a consultation on best consideration, and that is something that I think is important. A lot of our members are, I think, at the sort of more cutting edge of innovations in the sector in terms of trying to do joint ventures and other partnership arrangements with local authorities, and often best consideration rules get in the way. So in terms of delivering, I think, an optimal outcome for local communities, that consultation is important. And then the stuff around sort of local plans, just trying to take some of the conflict out of that. I think our members are not about sort of trying to push sand uphill. It's about having a clarity from a local plan and getting on with it. And so very pleased to see some of those provisions as well. Okay, so build to rent, a standout issue for you there. Richard, I'll just invite you in. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of entirely new opportunities for collaboration, I don't think there are very many, actually, or at least there aren't any that aren't already being done by some councils and some developers in some parts of the country. So I think it's good to recognise that good practice and to encourage other people to join in. I think the only new thing that I've picked up, and the thing that I think could be an opportunity for longer term gain for us all, is this focus on data collection, data analysis, what's actually happening. So perhaps we can move beyond the kind of anecdotal, they're a naughty developer, they're a bad council, and we can actually start to get a national picture about what's really happening.
Okay. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Richard that there are no real new opportunities, but I think there is a very different focus in terms of the way in which policy appears to be developing. And this had been trailed as a big planning white paper, but in fact, not a great deal of it is about planning. And one of the real areas that I suspect there will be opportunities going forward is in relation to land. And that sort of picks up on some work that a whole host of people have been doing recently, particularly in London, about what is genuinely holding up development. And in a lot of cases, that has been failure of land to come to the market. And there's a whole host of hints in the white paper about the way in which local authorities are going to be penalised if development doesn't actually happen, which will provide them with yet another incentive to start to bring forward land, perhaps using compulsory powers if necessary, looking at ways in which they might enter into direct development, so that building on the Northstowe type model that is already being pioneered, where the local authorities and government will be bringing forward new homes and paying a contractor's margin rather than a developer's margin on that, which has some advantages. And so there'll be a lot more, I think, exploration around that type of model, and the sort of point that Ian made about losing the fetters of things like best consideration, being a bit more sensible about procurement requirements, I think will provide a whole series of new models and new opportunities going forward.
I saw some nodding at the end from you, Richard.
Yes,
agree.
Yes.
Perhaps staying with you then, Richard. Provision that's been waited for, I think, or announcement that's been waiting for a long time has been around fees and the 20% increase on fees. Can you tell me, will this give planning departments the resources that they need to get the job done?
So I'll answer this question entirely honestly. I think that probably not is the honest answer. I think if you were to take the average planning authority, there's a gap between their costs of operation and the fees they receive of about 30%, 40% perhaps. So you might think, well, if the two phases of 20% and then the 20%, that brings them up to where they need to be, and that will be fine. I think the issue in councils who are, as we all know, cash-strapped organisations, is that at the moment, the corporate organisation is topping fees up to get the departments to where they need to be. So if the fees go up by 20%, I think it would be a very brave financial director in a council who will say, well, we won't take our 20% back out because we've got all these other needs over here. So my fear is that what will happen is fees will go up, and what we'll get is self-financing planning departments on average. I might return to that point. But actually, will there be more money for providing services? No, there won't.
Okay. And so what are the implications of this?
Can I make 2 points actually in response to that? One is that I think there's a lot of wasted resource in planning authorities, and that's in large part because they're being asked to do things which they really shouldn't be asked to do. So you look at one of the large-scale applications, and I'd say 70% of the material that is submitted with it, which takes up enormous amounts of time to review, is completely pointless. I mean, it's an exercise in redundancy. You'll have a retail impact report, which after 150 pages, having gone out to a consultant for a cost of 20,000 quid to review it, comes back and says, there's no effect, which anybody sensible would have realised after half an hour discussion. So you could cut out a whole load of what is dealt with as part of planning applications and free up planners to actually do what they're meant to do, which is look at the principles of development and say, is this worth consenting? So there's a resource issue that the fees won't address because they're doing work which they shouldn't be asked to do. The second is that, and this is where I think there's a real concern on the resources front, is that we should all be concentrating on a plan-led system. And changes in planning application fees don't even start to address that. And if you are working your way through a whole series of local plan documents, whether it be local plan, AAPs, an increasing willingness to look at segment by segment local plans, that's got a cost attached to it. It's backed up by examination of facils and things like that. And that's a resource which simply isn't touched by the increase in application fees. And there needs to be rather more attention, I think, given to that.
So more resources pumped into the strategic planning side,
yes.
The plan making side
and
of
cut
things.
cut down radically on actually what we ask planning officers to do as part of the application development management process, partly because it will have been dealt with through the local plan properly, so you'll have a plan-led system and it'll be far easier to say yay or nay, and partly because so much of what is done as the development management process is frankly useless.
Well, I'm going to invite you to come back because I can see Richard biting his tongue a little bit there, but I'll go first to you, Ian.
I suppose share the caution of the other speakers in terms of, to some extent, I could see the increase in fees being negated by the additional requirements that were in the white paper on the local plan making process, and so to some extent they sort of cancel each other out in terms of the money that's being brought in through development control. To some extent is negated. I think that'll be a great pity. BPF has, to some extent, sort of put its head on the block in terms of saying we will accept an increase in the fees, providing it goes into additional resource and is ring-fenced. And I think that's a sort of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do that. If it transpires that we don't see that additional resource, it'll be very difficult to go back to our members and to make that case again.
Richard.
Well, I don't think I'm going to disagree with Stephen. I mean, you might expect me to, but I don't think you won't find many people to defend entirely the status quo and the work that is done in terms of supporting an application. And I think many planning departments, partly through necessity and partly because they're sensible people too, have started to find more collaborative approaches towards the information, towards the scheme, and where the two parties both agree to buy the information once rather than our experts checking your experts and all the rest of it. I think a couple of points I want to get across. One is, and it's an important point, is that a 20% increase in fees you might think might lead to a similar effect across all of the councils out there. But because, and it's a slightly detailed point, but I'll try to get it across, because the fees aren't right at the moment, so major applications effectively overpay, and lots of littler applications underpay, and then the other categories of applications have no fee at all. So if you happen to have lots of heritage, lots of trees, not very many majors, you don't get anywhere near the money that you need to run your service, and you are heavily subsidised by your corporate centre. And a 20% increase in fees, yes, it will reduce the subsidy a bit, but it's not enough to support your service. Whereas if you're in an opposite to a regeneration area with not much going on, but major sites out there, you have more money than you need already. And a 20% increase in fees, there are some councils out there slightly scratching their heads going, well, we have to provide a commitment to spend this money. We don't know what we can spend it on because we're already giving all of this money away to the council. And I think it's a missed opportunity not to, if there is this once in a lifetime opportunity to reapproach how we fund the process. It's a shame that we haven't taken a deep breath and gone, shall we just make fees right? Because so many good things would flow from that.
Very interesting. So 20% on a baseline that's not necessarily correct is going to have a variable and perhaps some unusual effects. Well, very finally, we waited for the white paper for quite a long time. Were there any surprises in there? I'll go to you, Stephen.
Perhaps two surprises I'll pick out. I mean, the first was on the local plan front, and this is probably a very lawyers type point. There's a change of one word. And when you're looking at the test for soundness of a local plan, the suggested change is that we move away from being the most appropriate strategy, which is the test that's in the MPF at the moment, to being an appropriate strategy. Now, you may ask, well, what's the difference between an and most? And I think the difference actually is going to be quite radical. And it's already quite difficult to go along to a local plan process and promote a new site or to actually secure changes in policy. When a local authority has to have got things pretty dramatically wrong already to fail to get a plan through. And when you go around the country, there were some that fail on duty to cooperate, and that's relatively easy to do. But there's relatively few that fail on the soundness test. They have to try pretty hard to do so. But they're not even going to have their feet held to the fire that is only dimly burning embers at the moment. They're going to be able to simply say, is this an appropriate strategy? And how on earth, across a plan as a whole, does somebody fail that test? Well, of course it's an appropriate strategy. It might be a lunatic strategy, but it's still an appropriate strategy. And so I think we're going to face far less engagement in the local plan process. And Ian at the outset said, when we don't want to have conflict. Well, actually, we do. The local plan process should genuinely be about a conflict of interest, people promoting different sites, people promoting different visions for the way in which an area will develop, and an inspector listening to that, weighing up the evidence and deciding actually who's made the best case. And unfortunately, I think the shift in emphasis will diminish anybody's appetite to go to an inquiry. Why spend the money if you're fighting a foregone conclusion?
Ian.
Clarify my remarks firstly in terms of the no conflict was in the development control side of planning, and yes, clearly in the plan making process you're trying to bring different interests together and different perspectives, and yes, there will be conflict, and part of the local plan process is about trying to work through those and come up with the best thing that suits everybody, I suppose. In terms of your question, I was actually pretty pleased there wasn't many surprises. Tend to mean last minute things, sort of big ideas that some minister has sort of had and dreamt overnight about 3 days before, and they sort of get exposed to the world in sort of half-cocked form, and therefore to have a sort of compilation, I think, of a number of pieces of work that were actually going on and had been done reasonably thoroughly within the department was actually quite pleasing. And if there had been some sort of showstopper that I would have been probably sceptical, sort of starter homes or Help to Buy ISAs come to mind as things that have sort of gone off in all directions and haven't really been appropriately thought through before they're exposed to the world. I suppose there's sort of unfinished business in terms of things like the SIL review, and that's sort of been put out there for views, and it would be very interesting to see where that ends up in the autumn budget. But yes, I was rather pleased there wasn't that many things that sort of caught my eye as being different to what I'd expected.
So Richard, comfortingly few surprises, but perhaps opening the door to lunatic local plans. What are your thoughts?
I was going to say, you can't pretend that a lunatic strategy is an appropriate strategy, because for most places, a lunatic strategy is not an appropriate strategy. You've had two quite strategic answers. If it's okay, I'll go just dive right into the detail and sound really geeky again. Honestly, my most aha moment when I was working out the consequences of it is kind of hidden in there in the delivery test. And the way the delivery test bites is, I think, going to catch lots of people out because it bites quite quickly and quite hard. So if you're a council who is going to find it difficult to meet your need because you're heavily constrained or for whatever reason, and it's been accepted as such a few years ago in your local plan examination, quite soon, because your plan is more than 5 years old, all of that consideration is going to fly away and your test is going to be against your population projection. And for many councils, they are going to fail that test. And they're not going to be able to do anything in the short term, i.e. to get an up-to-date plan, to allow them to pass that test. So we've been set a really tough challenge. And it was only when I kind of understood that, I suddenly thought, this is going to be really difficult, for not just for a few lunatic councils who've been deliberately a bit naughty and underplaying their growth needs, but for hundreds of councils. I haven't quite done the maths, but I think that's going to be a real sting in the tail in the delivery test.
Okay, so perhaps, sorry, go for it.
So, two points in response to that. I think when I say lunatic, that is code to some extent. There are a lot of authorities I don't think will want to review their green belts. I think they're going to get a pass as a consequence of the change from and to most and from the rather more minor changes that relate to the green belt, but a very clear political signal that the green belt is not up for grabs. And that will lead to choices which I think are stupid long term. Lunatic is perhaps overstating it, but we are going to be constraining development. We are not going to be providing in some areas the homes that are needed. And that will have consequences, social consequences for the long term. And that strikes me as just being wrong. The other surprise I was going to mention was that it's a requiem for policies that, as Ian says, seem to be being slowly discarded. Starter homes is effectively dead. We had a whole passage in the legislation last year that dealt with starter homes. Now it's simply part of affordable housing. Things like the permissions in principle and brownfield register, and they're not there in any great substance in terms of what the white paper says. I think this is an exercise in slow burial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great discussion. Please. Yeah, some reported deaths in the white paper, some immediate bite, and perhaps some longer term consequences. We'll have to watch this space. Thank you.